And the text we read, it was a light reading this time, perhaps, with Gregory Bateson. It was 4 or 5 pages from the Treaty of Versailles and Cybernetics. That was written in 1966. So this is coming from after the war had happened. And we also read Nora Bateson's Parts and Wholes, Hope and Horror, along with one of her poems, which I think fits in very nicely, although the Gregory Bateson's essay and the Parts and Wholes kind of work very well together. I feel like her poem, Ecology of Love, fits in there as well as perhaps the antidote to all this overthinking or political action and all that. But so Bateson, I'll focus on Gregory Bateson's article and see how it proceeds from there. But it sounds like he's at another symposium. I don't know what the Two Worlds symposium is about, but there's 2 worlds they're talking about. Perhaps it's East and West, perhaps it's academia and everybody else. Who knows what it is? Perhaps you guys do. You can throw in your comments. But so he's flying into this conference, and it sounds like he's kind of piecing together his thoughts as he comes in. And but he focuses in on like what is going to count as important in history, in the history of the last 60 years. So at that time it was 1966. So there are quite a few events that happened, World War II and many other devastating events that occurred the first 60 years of the century. But he chooses cybernetics, which is an obvious choice for a man that's kind of in the middle of that muddle, and the Treaty of Versailles, which seemed like he said it's not such an obvious selection, but he's looking at it from an anthropological point of view. So it's significant for him because it's a point where attitudes have changed. He uses the thermostat, so there's kind of the natural setting of the thermostat. So the temperature gets too high, the system will regulate itself. But he's focused on when the person comes in and actually changes the thermostat. So they want the system to regulate to their needs. So he's that metaphor in a few other places too. And I think Angel's Fear, he also uses it. But so basically when the system setting or the bias has changed, so he's using this treaty as a turning point in attitudes changing. I don't know how deep I want to go into the history of the Treaty of Versailles, but essentially Germany was blamed for the war, and the big 3, Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, I think, and the French guy, George
More.
Clemenceau, that they were kind of the big 3 determining essentially the fate of the countries that were involved in Europe. There were a few other that were on the side, but I think there was a good quote, not from this, but from Lloyd George. He said when he was asked how did the treaty work out, or how'd you do in there? And he said, not bad considering I was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon. So there's Woodrow Wilson, who was seen as the saint in a certain sense, or the innocent person seeking the idealistic point of view, in contrast to Georges Clemenceau, who was essentially in the past, Germany had started wars with France, so this guy is straightforward. Germany's going to pay. We'll get reparations from them. We'll take their land. We'll take their resources and screw them. That's how the world works. And then the British Lloyd George was kind of caught in the middle. Not really caught in the middle, but he wanted some of these reparations. So there's a lot of different point of views coming in. And another essay that Bateson wrote, Gregory Bateson, was the morale and national character. So I'll read a quote from there, kind of give a little picture of what Bateson's talking about. This is when he was talking about symmetrical and complementary patterns. But the most conspicuous psychological hurdle to be negotiated in imagining such a peace treaty is the contrast between British and American symmetrical patterns and the German complementary pattern, with its taboo on overt submissive behavior. The Allied nations are not psychologically equipped to enforce a harsh treaty. They might draw upon such a treaty, but in 6 months they would tire of keeping the underdogs down. The Germans, on the other hand, if they see their role as submissive, will not stay down without harsh treatment. We have seen that these considerations apply even to such a mildly punitive treaty as was devised at Versailles. The Allies omitted to enforce it, and the Germans refused to accept it. It is therefore useless to dream of such a treaty, and worse than useless to repeat such dreams as a way of raising our morale now, when we are angry with Germany. And it goes on for quite a bit there, but essentially he noted the differences that perhaps Bateson had his own bias of how, and he also goes in that morale and national character that there's no official national individual or character, that there's always a mix of everything. But if we had to draw lines, then this is how Americans are, this is how the English are, this is how the Germans are. So that created, the Treaty of Versailles was important to him because that set the stage for a whole chain of events that led up to World War II. Of course, Germany didn't accept the peace treaty, nor could they. They didn't really have a chance to rebuild themselves. So when I think bottom line is when humans interact with the state of the world or change the system, there can be a lot of trust broken. There's hurt and suffering. There's the response to that. So the treaty led to the total demoralization of German politics, and everyone else around the world felt the demoralization. I guess before I go into the second half of the essay, which focuses on kind of the flip side of that, the more positive character of cybernetics and systems thinking as an antidote to kind of the political. Seeing if anybody had any comments or thoughts on how to proceed in the conversation.
Well, I think you did a pretty good encapsulation of the first part. I've read a lot about the Treaty of Versailles over the years, partly out of personal interest, mostly, but and I've read, Hitler's Mein Kampf and other things like that. So Hitler and the Germans strongly drew on the problems with the Treaty of Versailles to justify the development of the Second World War. I don't think it's quite that simple. I don't think you can reduce the Second World War to the direct consequence of the First World War quite that way, because it was also an ideological thing. And Nora Bateson in her text addresses those issues, I think, more subtly and more carefully than Gregory Bateson does in this text. And of course, it's interesting with the Nora Bateson article because she bridges the two links, the two events in a way that Gregory Bateson does not. So, drawing the roots of the cybernetics into the kind of thinking about fascism that followed from the First World War. So, and to some extent, wars themselves are part whole activities. So that also fits within the Nora Bateson's argument, I think. Anyway, I don't want to go because you have more to say, Doug. So I don't want to preclude what you.
Well, building off of that, she does start out. She starts out with the blind spots. So she's coming from the perspective of she was born in whenever, but she's focusing from when she wrote this was probably around 2016, 2017. So she can recognize the blind spots in systems theory or her father's thinking, her grandfather's thinking. And I think what Bateson was doing, he's coming from a time after the treaty was written. Even when he did whatever the other one I referenced, the morale and national character, that was done, I think, in maybe looking forward to what could be done to end World War II. I think it was 1943 when it was written. So he was reflecting on, well, this didn't work, obviously, and then the Versailles and Cybernetics was a reflection in 1966. So he's looking at the blind spots. And he does note, but not too deeply, he does note at the end of the essay, like cybernetics will have blind spots. There's some good quotes. And something I haven't mentioned too is the just he starts out with the quote, where is it? The fathers have eaten bitter fruit and the children's teeth are set on edge. So he's talking about how, like, no matter where you are in time or in history, you're in the middle, and your fathers beforehand had to eat bitter fruit, had to take the medicine to wash down all the sickness or something like that. And of course, there's side effects to medicine. Now the children so in our time we're focusing on a big issue, which is the opioid epidemic. So we wanted to solve all the world's psychological issues or mental issues or even physical issues. And there's tens of millions of side effects on each little drug that's introduced. And now there's lawsuits against these companies that some of them had good intentions, but others had the main focus to make money. And now in our age, we're in the middle of, well, what do we do with all this, even though half the country is addicted and in the midst of all this. So we're always in the middle of some sort of mess. That goes back to the very first thing we read, the muddle. But he lost my train of thought there. But so Nora has a good perspective, and she's done a lot of research within her own family on top of all the other great work that she does. But I think her focus on her grandfather, William Bateson. I haven't read much by him, but some of the quotes she did, from the one from Science and Nature, the very first, it says the 1918 address on science and nationality. I mean, I won't read the quote here, but I did read that address, and he has some supreme insight. There's some really good words in there to show she's saying that he was thinking system thinking before it was a term, and he realized that he too, with the coining of the term genetics and focus on what genetics can do, had opened up a whole can of worms for the nationalists to eat upon his work and take it in their own direction. I think I'll stop here for now, and if we want to I like Nora Bateson's article quite a bit, so maybe we'll take time to extract some quotes from there or kind of focus on her work. There's quite a bit more we can discuss here, and I think I'll stop because I'm feeling kind of muddled myself.
Yeah, reoccurring theme of somebody that's, goes all the way back to Gregory and Vietnam War and being raised by a father that was in the Korean War. This notion of being in the middle and trying to find a perfect system. And I'm using that word in a gross way, not in terms of systems thinking, because I think systems thinking is just, for my feel of it, is more or less of helping us not get it caught in the religious notion my group is the only right way to do it, because I think that kind of idea and thought is has a history of how human beings have come to interact with each other in terms of groups. But systems thinking is trying to at least loosen that tight grip up so that you can at least, well, to put it bluntly, maybe take stock of your blind spots. The thing with blind spots, though, sometimes you don't know they're there until it hurts. So that's just one thing that reading Gregory this week's passage and feeling into Nora, and this is why I'll bring Nora in, and her absolute dedication to the honesty of acknowledging when a blind spot shows up in her field, like with the incident with the interviewer, and her dedication or commitment, whatever you want to call it, to just holding her feet to the fire when blind spots get activated within us. And I just like that approach, because I think if more of us would at least accept or come to accept that we do have blind spots. And the trouble with that term, though, is what's the content of the blind spot. A lot of it is thought of as negative, and that's true. But I also, at where I'm at now, take a perspective of not jump too fast that what's in the blind spot is necessarily negative, but something to give attention to, because there could be something positive there if we pay attention. If that's my view.
Right. And going with the word attention, I think that's a good focus. So when a lot of studies, psychological studies that's on blind spots is like the gorilla that enters in. You may have seen the video of people playing basketball, and then there's a gorilla that enters in bouncing a basketball or just wiggling around doing all sorts of things. But the observer is told to focus on how many points I think the team is scoring or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think almost all or not, one or two notice the gorilla out of the 20 or 30 in the study, whatever the numbers might be. And it was good. That study is great to know that even our visual field, even if we see something really happening, we miss so much else going on. So when we say the term blind spot, it's not necessarily, like you're saying, a negative thing. The gorilla in that video is not one that's actually, it's a man dressed up in a suit or a woman. And it's not actually going to be a real gorilla mauling anybody, so there's no present danger. But if we take that into the context of politics and dealing with other countries, dealing with each other, then it maybe it's not necessarily a negative thing to be have blind spots, but it can easily build up into a disaster if the blind spots aren't taken note of.
Yeah,
Even
and
if it's not something tangible, if it's something like an idea, like she's talking about the trans contextuality.
well, and I think this also needs to include that the intelligence of of feeling or sensing a threat. There's a certain intelligence. Now, how well do we train ourselves to assess the threat? Going on your gorilla, right? In that study, that gorilla was a man and was first studied. But you walk out into the world like I do. I've trained my threat assessment to be not reactive, but there is still a need to accept and own that we do have a system that tells us if there's a threat or not. Does that seem fair? But we may have bad skills of assessing the threat. How threatening is it? Or is it just a startled response? Because those systems, when it comes to threat, are unconscious. They're hardwired into us. And it's like I walked out today and went and got coffee. And when I walked out under the tree, I felt a very thin piece of spider web land on my skin. 5 years ago, if that would have happened, I would have had much more of a startled response. So I'm just adding the acknowledgement that that base sense of threat needs to be trained, but it's still it's a system that we need to work with along with the other cognitive systems within our bodies and along those lines. That makes sense?
Does make sense. And I think to give a little bit more framework to this conversation and then open it up. Usually John and Geoffrey are the ones to jump in, and now it's the two of us. But I think I'll take parts from Nora's essay, the parts and wholes, hopes and horror. So I'll just maybe take some words that I underline and see if that encapsulates some of the whole of what she's talking about. And then maybe the conversation will fill in. I'd like for us to fill in the blind spots that I might have in talking about this, as well as just filling in and seeing where it goes. So I'll read the first two lines after the quote. There may be a blind spot in the way we make sense of the world that is holding back our ability to make the shifts necessary for human survival. Parts and wholes geared together to resemble a giant machine. Schematic blueprint. Clear defining lines between parts and wholes, nations and individuals, organisms and ecosystems. Pre-World War II levels of nationalism, declining ecological systems, presiding experts, recent years of violence, machine dream. Context matters. Organisms learn together. Contextual mutual learning. Why does it make sense to divide the world into abstract pieces? To see how it works. The child takes apart a watch. A watch is a mechanism, unlike a living system. It matters a great deal what image underpins our research. The tendency towards separation of disciplines in natural and social sciences was seen as the epistemological scaffolding within which separations between people, ideas, and nature would be logical and reasonable. Neo-Nazi description Earth systems interacting, irony. Both are founded on the idea that the world is made of parts and wholes that should remain intact in order to keep the social or environmental system functioning. The rate at which the coherence of our economic, social, ecological system is declining. Blind spots. Embrace uncertainty. Perhaps systems theory needs more dimensions. Transcontextual. Habitually removing ambiguity requires the simultaneous removal of transcontextual information. Aikido with paradoxes. Future studies. Presuppositions. Habitual. National efficiency. Altering the flavor of the stew. Mutual learning context. Reset the horizon. I'll stop there.
I want to give a little context based on what you said, is that what I like about Nora's approach, especially in this chapter, of challenging the machine metaphor. And when I talk about a relationship to our defense system and being used to acknowledge or to pay attention when there's threat, whether real or imagined in a way, that it's related to not as a in a mechanicalistic automatic way, but more in a more open system thinking way, that it's a system within my body that I have, that is connected to the other systems of cognitive, emotional, and how to bring online a systems thinking of all.
Sorry, somebody is knocking on the door. I have to leave you guys for a moment.
Of bringing more skillfulness of how these systems can work together. Like it kind of refers to what John and I were talking about before we started recording. So I just wanted to add that layer of understanding that it's more or less definitely not making our defense system a machine or automatic, but we do have to learn how to relate to it. When we use like she says, when we use the image of a machine, I think it creates a blind spot. It actually creates a blind spot of how we relate to it.
I'm reminded of something that was mentioned in the Aurobindo talks of the mother, Mira Alfasa, who was Aurobindo's kind of co-spirit.
Mm-hmm.
But she stated that during her deepest meditations, she would sense that a certain cell in her body or a certain locale in her body would be in response to how things were occurring in other countries, or a decision was made by some political person.
Mm-hmm.
And so the body can be many things.
Yes.
So,
yes. Thank you, Doug.
are you still with us, John?
Yes, I am. I'm listening carefully. I guess Geoffrey had a guest.
Yeah, somebody knocked at the door.
Oh, okay. I'm just waiting to find the catch the rhythm here. I think these are very perplexing kind of questions that we're asking, and I think she's pretty much nailed it over and over again. I like this phrase. A clarity without ambiguity is one in which we are all asking the wrong questions.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that's a real clear sign that, okay, there's a blind spot operating here, and it's not just, and it doesn't just belong to me. My blind spot belongs to you too. If you think you're going to inform me about my blind spot without addressing your own, I think this is what Jesus said. Before you remove the mote from your brother's eye, pull out the beam that is in your own eye. You cannot see another person's ego except through your own ego. I think these are the paradoxes which we like to leave out at first order kind of cybernetics. I believe that Bateson, Nora, and Gregory are transitioning out of first order. And I think Nora's definitely into the second order, maybe even a third order. I think these are different kinds of relationships one has to paradox and impasse and conflict when you're at the second order than when you're at first order. Because first order, you can pretty much tell when people are at first order. They're running the world right now. And it's about killing it, nuking it, cutting it out. Give it a drug. And, you know, if it increases our profit margin, let's do it. We'll ask questions later. Shoot first. I think these are the kind of things, these are the indications that let you know this is a first order organization, and it's basically based on separation. And I'm over here, you're over there. You have something I want. I'm going to arrange circumstances so that I can get it. This is what, you know, we're all been enmeshed in these systems. And some of us are alert to these messages and meta messages, and some of us are less so. But I think we're reaching a threshold where more and more people are getting less and less value from the current setup, that they can start listening to people who've been outside of this setup for a long time and start to appreciate, oh, there are messages that we've ignored, that we can no longer ignore. And I think, but these are signs that let me know that people are a little more sensitive. When the front page of the New York Times reports that a fifth of the coral reef has died in the last 3 years. This is sort of like the cat's out of the bag. if it's on the first front page of the New York Times, which is extremely slow to notice anything different, that I think is an indicator that something is starting to shift. But I also know when I was back in the 80s and very involved in the beginning of the gay movement and the threat of AIDS, virulent attack on us on many levels, the church, the state, and, you know, and the pharmaceutical companies and the medical establishment. But I remember looking at the cover of the New York Times over on 14th Street. I was walking down the street and I looked at it and it said, the AIDS epidemic will crush the gay movement. Everyone will go back into the closet who's come out. And I just felt in my gut, my solar plexus, this boom, 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 boom. And it was red hot and it hurt. And I said, fuck that shit. That's not gonna happen. And I mobilized people, everyone I knew mobilized someone they knew, and we gathered together all over the city, and we changed the system. And we had to do that in ways that were sometimes very theatrical and very funny and hyper sarcastic, and also to get the attention of the media, which is very stupid. You know, you just have to, You just have to basically pull down your pants and moon at them, and they're going to have a camera there. You know, they're incredibly manipulable. And I think that's where we need to start thinking about how can you triangulate at the margins and create a different kind of boundary than the one that's very embedded in a first order orientation, which is very heavily subject-object divided. And I think this is where we're in trouble, real big trouble. And it's also great creativity that could be unleashed if there are enough persons who can triangulate at the margins. And this is something that I'm borrowing from a cybernetician, Lee Hunt. She's a second, I think she's at the third order, and I think she looks at Bateson quite a bit. And she's a sort of creating a different kind of systems theory. And I think was, you know, forming back in the 40s and the 50s when Bateson was working with these complex ideas. Anyway, I also just wanted to, having sort of ripped on that, I look at perceptual systems and abstract spaces and location and the visible and the invisible. Where is the United States? Where is Germany? Where is France? Where is Hollywood? I had a very good friend who worked in the film industry, and she was visiting me here in New York. And she was on her cell phone a lot, making deals with people here in Manhattan. And I remember she hung up the phone and was totally exhausted. And she was complaining about a problem that she had, an intestinal problem. And I laid her down on the table because I was doing energy work at that time. And I did a scan with my hand, and I could feel where the problem was. I just put my hand over, I didn't even touch her, but I just let it hover there in her subtle energy field. And I just said, green, breathe in green. And she did it. And she said, after 5 minutes, she says, oh, the pain is gone. And she got up and she said, you know what I've learned? I'm here in Manhattan, but Hollywood is a state of mind. And I thought that was great, because there's something I think about the holography and the holo movement and holograms and the quantum. These are all new metaphors that are emerging out of our interaction with different kinds of technology. And I just think, just as Freud used the steam engine, the idea of hydraulics and ego, id, super ego, and displacement, and that kind of hierarchical arrangement, all based on the cutting edge technology of his time. And we're probably doing that right now, even as we speak, and using these computers. The mind as a computer metaphor has been kicked around quite a bit, and I think it's been deconstructed quite a bit. I think the more people start to use computers, the less likely they are to romanticize computers and think that the computers have all of our answers. I think there's a widespread discontent with the idea that we're just going to lay on more technology on our fragile ecosystems, and it's going to produce something that's going to be different. So I think that's encouraging that we're moving from a first order out of that to a kind of second order, maybe a third order, as we start thinking about the quantum, the particle and the wave, and the new kind of technologies that could emerge when people were attuned to these kind of subtle communiques that can happen between the field and a centered intelligence. And if that centered intelligence is centered with the intelligences of other centered intelligences, what is the relationship to the field? And I think this is the challenge as we start to use this technology to not pay attention. I'm trying to correct my language here, but to give attention, to give it away in a focused way. Right? I'm not giving away my attention to the TV program and letting that TV program direct my interior world. Your couch potato trance state, pretty low level trance state. but there are higher level quality trance states that we can activate with one another through the use of our language and gesture and attention. And I believe we're doing that right now. And let's do more of it and do it on purpose. And I think our sense of agency will get sharper and more defined and clearer and cleaner. And I believe that that's going to be really important, that we clean up our language around death. Let's clean up our language around agency, because I see it rapidly vanishing in this sort of smartphone mirage. Anyway, that's my spiel, and I have a lot more to say, but I can press the pause button and be open to what might happen next. Thanks.
Well, I like Nora's, you quoted Nora, but and I agree we need more clarity and better use of language. But I agree with Nora, that's not going to come unless we work with the blind spot of the ambiguity within language when we do use it. For me, the more I accept the ambiguity, the better my ability to be clear, if that makes sense. Well, I'm going to draw on her. It's a good metaphor. The Aikido Paradox, she uses that. I think and that's one of the things I think that quantum mechanics and Zen have in common. They both want to sit with the paradox and what is this? And not to be, or to sitting with it is not like, it doesn't mean to be seated. It's more or less to sit with it is to inhabit. And there's a different quality because there's action involved. Like you keep pointing to, John, that we kind of have a hard time with this notion that action, non-action, they kind of work together. The rhythm, I guess, would be that the rhythm of action, and within action, there's this pausing, maybe not stopping, but pausing.
Right. I definitely believe there's a between action, between active and passive, there's a boundary, and I believe those are negotiated through thresholds.
Yes.
I can sit back, let somebody else do this. I got other things to do until I get enough signals that become signs that then become urgent, that I need to, give my attention to something in my environment that's becoming a stressor. And then I notice it's stressing out others. Then we might get together and form some sort of coalition. And then we can have some impact. So we have to find groups that are going to be sensitive to the same kind of stresses that we're sensitive to, so that then we can mobilize. And this is very tricky. So you're moving from an I to a we, but the I and the we are, as we all know, in families and organizations and different contexts, it's very fluid. And when do I start to identify with a group is very, very fuzzy. And so I think that ambiguity isn't going to be erased. I don't, so I'm just, let's work with it and just recognize the signs of fatigue when a group of people is trying to lift something that's too heavy for the group to lift.
Right.
Or is it there's too many people here to get anything done? Too many cooks in the kitchen? I mean, these are all patterns we're pretty familiar with. So we have to sort of figure that out. And even in our framing of what we're going to talk about this week in the cafe, or what do we want to study together? What is important for us to focus attention and create the time and the leisure to work with with some of these very complex ideas. And I think that's one of the things I notice when people say, oh, this is a great idea, let's do this. And say, oh, okay, let's do that. I'll show up. And, you know, they don't show up. You showed up and you did the homework. They didn't. So what are you going to do in those kind of circumstances? Keep showing up? Or you're going to say, maybe we should take a little more time and thought into making these commitments.
Right.
So we can, whoever decides to show up will be there at the end, rather than half the people dropping out. So I don't know how to do that yet. You know, it's about scheduling and how wide a net can you throw? I mean, if we want to go international from Australia to Germany, you know, it's not going to happen. We've already seen that, you know, we've had people come from Australia, mainland United States, Europe. How do you arrange a conference call over that kind of, you can't. It's after midnight for some people and it's early morning for other people.
Right.
So I think those are the kind of asynchronous kind of communications where we can't arrange a Zoom call to accommodate all those different areas, those regions, because we are still embedded in day and night, these diurnal rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
And we have those 90-minute ultradian rhythms of rest and activity. And there are many other kinds of rhythms that we don't have options. We can't just say, oh, you know, I don't think I'm going to sleep for a couple of days. See what happens if you decide to override those kind of rhythms. So I think we're in, I think we're in a, you know, it's a real experimental space that many of us are in. How do we how do we create coherent we spaces with these kinds of constraints? Sure, it opens up all kinds of possibilities. And I believe we're enjoying some of those possibilities. But we're not free of constraints, that's for sure.
Well, and I also just want to add, and this is actually from your influence, your language, that if we attend to, besides the cognitive, you know, but the affective and how I like you do this last time. There's a difference between the affective and the emotion. You do a distinction that I liked about that, because yeah, I know, but it struck me that the affective zone or the effect is, in my image, deeper than the pop-up of an emotion.
Oh yes, yes.
You know,
that difference is interesting for. I haven't remarked on it before, but
okay.
for French, because French doesn't have a word for feeling. It has a word for sentiment, affection, and emotion, but it doesn't have a word for feeling. And so this distinction between affect and emotion works well in French, because there is a very clear distinction in French, but not in English as much. So interesting. I've always felt that
Thank you, Gregory. That's nice. Where I was going with it is in terms of, and so I'm drawing on my personal experience and my trauma, that the more I sensed into the affect, so that I could bring awareness to the emotion in terms of especially a state of ambiguity, because the emotion that popped up in the affective field of ambiguity was anxiety, you know? And so it was a meditative experience to acknowledge the emotion of anxiety, but breathe and sense into the underneath of what is showing up when I label a distressor of ambiguity.
That's
right. And ambiguity is an interesting word along with uncertainty, right? So we tend to focus on uncertainty in these texts, but ambiguity is also a relevant issue. I had a few things I wanted to say, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I hope the interview at the door, you had a guest or a stranger. I hope that all worked out okay.
It was my neighbor, So
Oh, okay.
Some
Because you
things
jumped up. It really grabbed our attention. I was really curious about what happened. But
it was a thing about the house and some arrangements around the house. So because I'm part of a duplex and they're on the other side. So, so one of the things I was thinking while I was listening is because Nora Bateson makes a thing about the parts and wholes. And of course, we all know that parts and wholes are also related to category making issues, right? So, and we know that categories are both a strength and a weakness, that they have to be dealt with carefully. Parts and wholes are also parts of hierarchy. They're not the only kind of hierarchy. There are several different kinds of hierarchy that we use, but so we all know that we need to be careful about a hierarchy. And I think where we're going is we're becoming much more sensitive to issues, to the problems of identity, as identity in a way is kind of related to category in a kind of way. And we, as I can't remember whether Johnny, which of you was talking about it, but I think that might have been you, Michael, that but it's in Nora's text too, that we're not one identity. We are many identities that interpenetrate. So it's an entanglement idea, like the quantum stuff, right?
Yes.
Much more than it is, you're over here and you're over here, and there's these. So this is the whole thing with nations as an identity is an entanglement issue more than it is a part whole issue, right? So, or it's got both of those elements in it, but you can't attend only to the part whole and miss the entanglement, or you'll go wrong. And obviously, the fascist neo-Nazi, this kind of stuff, wants to make hard, clean boundaries between all of these things, and so that's part of the issue. So I have a whole slew of things. In the name of
diversity, they want to do that.
Yeah, well, that's their reappropriation of the language, right?
Yes, right. Sorry.
Nora Bateson was talking about uncertainty, and it's important. I think so. I mentioned last time that I had this encounter with this guy who was doing Holocaust denial stuff, and the thing about the Holocaust denial stuff, I've heard it several times over the years. It's these arguments about the gas chambers in Auschwitz, and it's very technical argument about that this doesn't make sense and this can't be done, and it's the same argument every time it comes forward. People are digging into the same texts, and as I was saying, I was listening to an interview with on the radio about this, and so it's a guy who's just written a book called Truth Denying about this. And he points out that it's a text that is completely unfounded and has been deconstructed by several academics, but it is still being used as the driver for these arguments. And the problem with these arguments is that when people propose them, they are rocks. They do not admit the possibility that this could be wrong. The argument is presented as, this is a science, it is truth, and you are crazy, or it's just not admitted that there could be any problem with this. And this is a problem with the discourse around science, the pseudoscientific kind of approach, because if you talk to a real scientist about their work, there are things they are certain of that are part of the background. But in terms of the actual work they're doing, it's all hypothesis, it's all testing. There's no certainty there. And so non-scientists tend to assume that scientists are certain, but they are not, and between scientists, we're more conscious of our uncertainties than we are of our certainties. And so I think part of the blind spot of this thing about that Nora Bateson is trying to to get at is also, so she talks about uncertainty in the context of accepting uncertainty in ecological systems and systems thinking and this kind of thinking, but it's also in the discourse between experts and authorities. There's a kind of uncertainty that's necessary. So I did want to sort of tease that out from the discussion. She talks about transcontextual learning or I can't remember the exact term, but it's,
yeah,
I think
that's right.
Yeah, and systems understanding. Paradox she talks about, which is another one that I'm strongly in favor of. She doesn't talk in this text about the arts-based learning that I could see, but elsewhere she does, right? So, and Gregory Bateson does as well. So arts-based approaches are also, I think, critically important in this context. Because you do step out of the sort of fixed boundary, divided, separated pieces when you do an arts kind of approach to things. The quantum perspectives I talked about, singularities, which is my area of one thing, but I think is an interesting thing. Field-based thinking. So I had an experience on the weekend where. Because I've been talking to my friends about this idea of thinking of each of us as we move through the world as being overlapping fields. And one of my friends says, I really like this idea that you have of overlapping fields, but you need to attend to your own field. She was tapping my wrist because I was doing some things with regard to her and some friends that she thought I wasn't being attentive enough to my own field. I thought, she's right. I need to pay attention. So it's all very well to intellectualize these overlapping fields, but there's a practical side of these overlapping fields as well. And that means being attentive to the field of relationships that we have with each other and addressing those issues as they come forward, attending to them and then addressing them. So I thought that was a very interesting personal lesson. I think that was my list of things that I wanted to talk about. There was a quote from Nora that I wanted to repeat. And I think it's near the end. Oh yeah, I have no doubt that the most desirable real estate in Europe 10 years from now will be in the places where the integration of incoming refugee and immigrant groups was treated with the most grace. It just seemed to me a kind of a clin d'oeil, what's that, a wink at, when you do things right, there are long-term consequences that are beneficial, hopeful. And when things are snarled up into knots, that's, in the long term, those will be places that have, scars that linger long time afterwards, right? So.
Can you read that quote again?
I have no doubt that the most desirable real estate in Europe 10 years from now will be in the places where the integration of incoming refugee and immigrant groups was treated with the most grace.
Ah, yes. You raise a lot of interesting things there, especially science and real science. And I'm really curious about what is science before it becomes real science. I think that's extremely paradoxical. And art. I know these are the issues that you've brought to the table many times, Geoffrey. And we could research this for quite a while, I think. And art, and what is that relationship? As you say, the real scientist knows when he or she is creating a hypothesis or a model, and when they're just making things up. They know that difference, and they're alert to that. Where there's something that's evidence-based, and experiments and control groups and the traditional ways of working. And where you have to, where you imagine, I hear a lot of background noise, but there's that, I think, tension. And I believe that art, people who are working with cultural workers, as I believe most of us are here, and those who are in the arts and the sciences, I believe how are we going to use our imaginations? Working with these incredibly complex questions. And when there's so much evidence, I think that has been acquired in a reputable way, in a very scientific way, but we're not going to be able to address, I don't believe we're able to handle this complexity without the arts and without the intuitions of many persons who are, on the ground and really dealing with, in very direct ways, with, phenomena that looks very different when you're in a conference room looking at graphs and charts on a wall or on your laptop. So I think this is something that I think we're all aware of, and I think Nora is extremely aware of. And I remember, this is drawing on my own personal experience, but there's some working with community under stress. But I remember, I often worked with people who had been given a scientifically endorsed death sentence. And so what do you do with someone who has no, their T cell count may be very low, but they haven't had a cold in years. They've been given this diagnosis. If they have a lot of energy and they're thinking about things and they want to make commitments, they want to get on with their life, but they have this diagnostic label stuck to them. And that's where you see people, the inside, the outside, the external, the internal, the interior, the exterior, that kind of paradox, being able to work with that is extremely important. So I would often take a person who has a real stuck state. I want to do this, I want to do that, but I've been told you can't do this, you can't do that. And there are all these reasons that authorities are giving me why I can't have what I want. So I would just say, let's look at that in a different way. And let's go, as I think Bateson and Nora and Gregory do, to another level. Or this person's going to stay stuck forever. Now, and I often would do these sometimes very simple exercises where I would just take the person, put them in the center of a room. Sometimes we were alone, if it was like a one-on-one, but sometimes there were groups, large groups participating. And I would ask them, who are your sponsors? Who are the people in your life that really appreciated you, who saw something unique in you and wanted to help you develop that? And very often, most everybody could find somebody. It could be your mother or father, or it could be a teacher, or it could be someone in history that you never met, but that has inspired you, Gandhi or Mother Teresa, or it could be a pet that you had when you were 5 years old. So just arrange them in the room. So you have the pet that loved you when you were 5 years old. You have Mother Teresa over there, and you have a teacher over there, and see them. I can see the animal, I can see these sponsors, and I can step into them imaginatively. I can step into Mother Teresa. I can step into that little animal that loved me. I can step into that teacher I had in high school. And I can I can see through their sensorium the self that I am, who's in the center of that triad. And what happens is when persons come back to the center and they're taking with them the messages from those that saw something special in them and sponsored them when they were at previous stages in their development, that kind of energy and information is still in their system. And then you can ask them, what is the meta message? What is the message that all of those sponsors are offering? They each have a unique message to give you, and it's usually comes through in a kind of rhythm. But there's also a meta message, very much like a chord. You have 3 notes, separate notes, but then if you press them at the same time, it creates overtones. So I think that's the message and the meta message of those who are sponsoring you are still there in your system, in your sensorium, and your capacity, I believe, to give and receive these kinds of messages relies not on the 5 basic senses, but on a repertoire of very subtle senses. And this, I believe, is moving much more towards something that's quantum than a hydraulics model where Freud is talking about ego, id, and superego displacing one another. And so these are the kind of practices that actually reorganize a person's system, and it is through multiple agents. There are multiple identities, of course, and then there are also different kinds of agency. And I think this is kind of a problem. It's becoming a chronic problem when people are offloading these paradoxes and dilemmas onto abiotic systems. I don't have to remember anything. My computer will do that for me. Oh, good luck with that one. If you ever had your computer crash, you know how flimsy your memory can be if you're not using it. And so we've always had this problem. I mean, Socrates and Plato were arguing about, well, do we really need writing when that would destroy people's ability to learn anything through speech, which is much deeper and more powerful than anything you're going to read or write. And those kinds of human interactions, we want those to flourish. So reading and writing is dangerous, those kinds of oral cultures. Now, of course, we're over that. And Plato, thank God, didn't follow what he preached, because he wrote tons of dialogues, which we now can read, and we would never have had access to them at all without reading and writing. So I'm just sort of riffing on this, because I believe that each of us is probably caught in the undertow of this sort of cybernetic early AI, and even those who are hardcore materialists are recognizing materialism isn't working the way we thought it was supposed to work, and a lot of projects are getting stalled. So I think there is an openness, and those of us who've read The Flip, or who may be looking at Alexander Wendt, I'm reading his book now on quantum psychology. And I think this ties in with what we studied earlier with Aaron Manning. Remember Aaron Manning and talking about the cut? Where do you make the cut? Mm-hmm. And the difference between affect and emotion, as we discussed yesterday actually with Ed, where he talked about the difference between irk, peeved, and we have different words for these different kinds of states, and we assign descriptions to our emotional states, and this gives us some leverage. It's very important. If we can't describe our emotions, they often get the better of us. So I'm just putting that out there, because I think there's a lot of interesting work Brian Masumi has done on affect theory, and I think this is another interesting possibility, someone we should study, along with revisiting Aaron Manning's work, which some of us focused on. Anyway, I'm just putting all of this out there. And one other thing about totalitarianism and looking at the the Treaty of Versailles as Gregory was doing, and his response of his father at the breakfast table, who was reading about the Treaty of Versailles and the proposal to forgive Germany, and his father was like, it seemed to me that his father didn't think that was a good idea, that his own father was rejecting that. And I think that what previous generations rejected and what they accepted, we're living out of that right now, and we're going to be kicking that can down the road. So I think we're obliged. I feel obliged and a deep responsibility to use all of my knowledge and to use it well, and to sponsor others in using all of their knowledge and using it well. I believe we have a lot of knowledge, and I'm very optimistic on my best day. So I think what's your motivation to get you off of your butt to actually do something. And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people, because they like to sit on their butt and say, why isn't someone doing something about this? So I think we're all being infantilized in many ways by this technology. And I think it's intentionally some people are manufacturing our consent through this algorithmic mania. But I don't think it's going to end very well. Just as Hannah Arendt, when she traces the history of totalitarianism in Germany, and she was a victim of it. She had to flee from Germany. She came to the United States, taught the new school, actually, not far from where I live. And she said the roots of German Nazism were from the American Deep South. The rhetoric of the slaveholders in the Deep South was what the Nazis used to create the conditions for their takeover, which was not inevitable. Hitler could not have won the way he did if there weren't people who said, let's just give the guy a chance. Who knows? There were a lot of people who just said, this isn't my problem. And I think that's the challenge for us. So anyway, I've probably bitten off more than I can chew, but I just want to open that up to possible study groups in our future as this one winds down, and thinking about what we've learned and what applications might come from the learnings, and how can we ground our learnings and amplify those learnings.
Doug, did you want to say something?
I have a bullet-pointed list of notes, but nothing on the last comment there. I was, I guess I'll read part of Nora's poem, The Ecology of Love, that was speaking to what Johnny said, perhaps in the midst of like the energy of embodiment. So I won't read the whole thing. The last 7 lines. And in naming you, I grasp and find there are no completions, nothing in straight lines, only affection, reaching, reading the gestures that spread everywhere. I haven't read Masumi. That's another individual that I find challenging. I don't have a history of Deleuze or anybody else that he draws upon, but he goes in his own direction. The book, The Politics of Affect, has always interested me. So yeah, if that enters into one of the reading groups, if we even just focus on it for a couple sessions, whatever it might be, that would be very useful.
That's a good one, Doug.
Yeah, it is.
I actually think that we could probably get Brian to come in and talk to us about some of his work, because I know him quite well. So,
Good.
and he is retired, so I think he probably has the time
There's
if
a
we
group
ask
of you
very
forming.
nicely.
So there's a group of you retirees forming there.
Exactly.
We promise to behave.
So I think we could certainly look at Brian's work. I mean, there's what animals have to teach us about politics, which is also a very interesting text that he wrote. So that along, and I think there's a third one, right? There's the one on the one you just mentioned on the politics of affect, is it?
Yeah.
But there's a third text that he also, which is also really relevant. Trying to think
Semblance and event. That's the only other one that comes to mind, but I don't think it's related. But semblance and event, or something.
No, it's something else. Hang on. Anyway, I'll find it and get back to what it is. But
Politics of everyday fear.
no, it's not that one. But they're
one.
all interesting. Anyway, so maybe I'll look at that and see whether we can tease something out of that. Because it might be readings in Masumi rather than any one book, something like that, where we would pick out pieces that we could look at. Something,
perhaps
just
the
because
cafe would be a good way to step into that. I don't know if you can attend.
Yeah.
He's not easy to read. I'd be very cautious about doing this on the cafe on a week, because to me he's like very dense.
He's very dense to read. I agree.
And not everyone. I don't know if Ed would like reading Masumi, but it depends on who shows up. So I think a study group is where I would want to go with Masumi because he's so dense.
There was something else you said that I'll steer us back to Bateson somehow maybe, but the Plato's idea of the oral culture on decline, while in the midst of writing and coming up with his own aspects of how to perhaps perceive and transmit the spiritual or the infinite realm onto paper, the arts. And I find that personally interesting, coming from the perspective of a non-writer, while at the same time I put thought out posts on the forum. I have written a few things. I've done introductions that were metalogs that took a little bit of time. So, but I'm one to say that I want to get past writing. I don't want to write. I want to, in these talks, have the oral culture develop. I like the memorization of poems, for example. Doesn't occur. There was somebody talking recently, or something I read, or some talk I listened to about how when he was younger there was memorization of deep poetry. This isn't kindergarten, like recite a nursery rhyme or something. It was like hone in on really deep poetry or Shakespeare. And now in schools, it's not there. Even in colleges, perhaps it's not there, and it's being shut out. And I really want to develop poetry in the moment. I don't want to write poetry, although I do that because I want to get these thoughts out on paper. We spoke of telepathy at one point in one of the I guess our cafe, and that would be ideal to where, we have these 10 bullet points we just made of what we want to say, and then everything disappears as it comes time, and all we have left are these words that embody some sort of feeling. So when I said energy of embodiment, I had multiple actors come into play, and Masumi came up, and Aaron Manning, and talks we've had, and Geoffrey, entanglement and quantum, and all this comes up within that phrase. And I just wrote it on paper, but it doesn't. I'll look at it next week, and I won't remember anything about what that means other than sounds nice. And I don't know how this ties in with Bateson or Nora, but there's something about what we do here that needs to be amplified rather than written, or there doesn't need to be any more theories, although they're nice. There needs to be more something. And what Nora's done in her book, it is that something. But what exactly is it? I might come away with semaphysy or mutual learning or transcontextuality, but and also what I've extracted as a core element. But how do I place that into the world? How does it become oral culture? I'm not going to write a book on Nora Bateson or systematize her theory. That would defeat the point. So how do we utilize the parts that we extract into some sort of whole and see the entanglement? Or perhaps we're doing that now, and it's the best we can do. I don't know.
So there is two. We did have two sets of homeworks that we've talked about so far, both in that line. One is Everyday Bateson, which I think maybe because this idea of overlapping fields and thinking of people as overlapping fields. Michael, you did an exercise on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's like a metaphor image that we could promote. I don't know that we can change the world, but we can maybe change a small part of it. And the other exercise besides Everyday Bateson was a 20-year plan for the planet,
Mm-hmm.
which I also think would be a useful exercise to do, and one that needs to be not confined to this group. Needs to be. So I've started to talk about it with friends to say, oh, could we at least talk about this?
Yeah.
And move it beyond this particular group as a social project, if you like, societal project.
Expand our social field beyond to a larger social field. I wanted to come back around to this notion of identity because I've run into, it's been an ongoing thing with me for a long time. And I think in the culture, identity has become in with identity politics. It's for some reason I'm not, identity politics is interesting in and of itself. But so I'm going to just paint a picture of how I relate to identity, and maybe that then I to give a frame of reference. First of all, because of my Zen practice, identity is like an open-ended circle. There is a circle. I do have my identity is I've drawn a line around it from, I've created a line through my experiences, but it's open-ended. There's an opening. And the reason for that is for things to flow out and to flow in, to have this exchange between the inner and outer. And one of the things I think that I've gone through with this notion is because of my life experience with trauma is what happens when that circle or that center, and a lot of identity can be thought of centers or, circles or spheres that we have. I'm just ripping off my own imagination, pardon. I had an encounter recently of talking in a conversation where identity politics came up, and I was trying to be sensitive, but I had a problem with the political side is this person was only coming from a very specific identity and not wanting to include other people, like what has been done to their identity And I didn't want to dismiss what was done to their identity. That is a fact. But the way that they've related to what happened to their identity, saying this was a female and what happened to her, had a certain edge that I could feel that men are responsible for it. All men are responsible for it. And that created a tension because I was negotiating, trying to practice like we're practicing, is that I take her experience, I'm sensitive to it, but do you realize that there's young men we send off to war? I've had sisters, I've had girlfriends that I had to bear witness of their rape and their misabuse, and it just turned into a very little touchy thing of me trying to walk that fine line. I didn't want to dismiss her particular identity experience, but it was, I just had a, wait a minute, can we enlarge this a little bit? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it's delicate. No, it was a delicate situation. Even for me, I mean, I know I was kind of awkward. I felt a certain awkwardness, but I also felt a need, like you, John. I'm being funny, but part of you channeled of, I'm going to speak up. Wait a minute here, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it had too much of an edge of political correctness, which I'm not totally against, but when the way people use it is where I could make the cut.
Oh, right. I'm identified as gay. I'm much more than just gay.
Yeah, right.
Lots more things are going on. I have never said, and I do not believe, all heterosexuals are responsible for my oppression.
Exactly.
That is utter and complete bullshit.
Yeah.
And I will not let, and if someone around me says something like that, I will declare they are very stupid. You know,
Okay.
You don't blame everyone for your problem.
Right.
And now that doesn't mean that others do not bear some responsibility for the conditions that have created certain circumstances for you that are unjust and unfair. And we do need to make very subtle discriminations.
Okay.
But let's not throw out the baby and the bathwater by making these gigantic, all of these people are to blame for my circumstances. And it's a very disempowering position to be in, because you're the perpetual victim. And this is where I, have stressed how important it is that triangle, the drama triangle about victim, oppressor, and what was the other one? Victim, persecutor, and then there's the rescuer.
Oh, rescuer, yeah.
Yeah. So someone's a victim, so they demand someone to rescue them. And there aren't, if you're an adult, there are not many people around who are going to rescue you unless they're going to extract a very big price for that. So I think those are the kind of tensions and stresses that I had to work through, very complicated ways, and I believe we all have to do that, find our own ecology. But I certainly don't have any answer. And once again, I think any answer that we would come up with would be probably premature. And this is what I believe that Nora and Bateson are extremely well aware of, that we can't just hope to iron out all of these paradoxes and make things simple and plain and obvious, because it's very, very messy, and we're often in the muddle. And I also wanted to, because I know we're getting sort of about 20 minutes left. I was really interested in something that Doug was talking about. I want the oral culture to develop. I don't want to write, but I do write. So I'm sort of just my model of the world here. I'm working with, when you hear something like that, I believe there's an indication that there's a bind, but it's a fuzzy one. I want this. I don't want this, and I do want this. I do, it's what would you say? I don't want to write, but I do write. And I want the oral culture to develop. So if I were to work in a clean way, I would plan to say something like this. And when I don't want to write, but I do write, is there anything else about that I? That's one clean question. There are a lot of other clean questions I could ask. And I want to write, and I don't want to write, but I do write. What kind of right is that? And when right? What would you like to have happen? Those are possibilities. Of course, however way you responded would be directing my inquiry with you. But there's also working with trance logic. This is definitely, I think clean language supports trance logic rather than the kind of logic which is either or, which is usually where we get into trouble, is when we have a logic that's dominated by it's either this or it's that. I think trance logic invites us into exploring the excluded middle. So with that, and I think also our that either or kind of logic tends to get caught in our musculature, our neuromuscular locks are usually come into play because our nervous system is being forced to embody double and triple messages, which is very stressful. It's like pressing on the brake and the accelerator at the same time. So I think those neuromuscular locks, if we can be open, let them be there and give our attention to them and turn it into a breath rather than a lock. Just breathe, as we've been practicing very often, working with meditative capacities. But I'm also thinking about, I can see, Doug, that you don't want to write. I can also see that you are a good writer.
Yeah, right.
I really like your monologues, your metalogues, especially for this. These Bateson calls have been extremely creative. And when I can see that you don't want to write, and that you are a good writer, it's nice to know that your unconscious can do both at the same time. So I'm just offering that to the field of all possibilities, from my center to Doug's center, to Michael's center, to Geoffrey's center, and be curious about what happens next.
Right.
Which I have no clue. I don't need to know, thank God. So I don't need to give any advice to anybody. That's very time-consuming and exhausting. I don't know if you've ever tried to give advice to someone who's in a stressful situation. But anyway, I'm just putting that out there because I think that these are ways that we can work with these complex questions and concerns, and how we ask questions from a center, and how the field can respond in very different and sometimes surprising ways, but often sometimes very powerful and emphatic, but sometimes extremely subtle. And to me, it's like chunking down and chunking slow, rather than let's come up with a great topic for the next thing. Just gotta get to the cafe. You know, how many footnotes can you read this week? I can read 100. Can you read 100? Okay, let's get together and talk about the 100 footnotes we read. You hear that kind of franticness. And I'm just saying, if we could just sort of let go of those neuromuscular locks and our anxiety about getting something right, I believe we can be a little more attentive to what, chunking down, chunking slow, those deeper, those slower rhythms, which are much more profound than da 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 da. But this da 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 is important. Those innovative capacities that we have are very, very fast. So it's sort of like, I'm not advocating slow is better than fast. I'm just saying we need to find the blends, so that we can have a more multi-sensory, polyphasic cultural exchange here, rather than being dominated by the monodialogues of the faster, 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 faster.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you want to say something, Michael?
Well, see, the thing is, I was using my kinesthetic movement to reach out and communicate. And when you were saying muscular locks, it activated in me. This is a sense that is not well developed in this society. It's pushed away, it's numbed out, and I think it contributes to poor communication, because our muscular, our sense of our musculars and our sense of kinetic, even with the jaw muscle, the muscle of our own jaw, I think because of my trauma and how I have had to come out of being traumatized with my body being banged up, it became on the order of developing much more intensely along the kinetic sense of muscle movement and position. Not so much as a dancer, because I was a maintenance worker, but just how I move my body in general. I do like dance, but I realize that sense is what helps us, like you say, perform. It's part of the performance, and it comes in play. Even it's part of the performance, even giving attention to emotion or energy arising, the energy of anger. I've used it to help feel, oh, this is coming up. When I was doing a bouncer, I had to pay a lot of attention of what was coming up, because some of the information I was getting non-verbally from the person I approach, I had to assess what kind of threat, what level, because the information, I may be misinterpreting the information too. I have to own that. I could be misinterpreted, so I had to keep my connect sense on track. Best metaphor for this that I'm saying is like a surfer on a wave. Feel your feet on the board, and the stuff underneath you is moving. So I had to very quickly learn what kind of threat is this person, and if I'm picking up some information, and if I trust it, well, and I'm slowing it down, but this could take place in split seconds. And so I just think that we need, that's why some of the embodied movement, as much as I appreciate it, it's missing the mark in a lot of ways, because it's not really holistic in some senses. So, I just was activated by your descriptions, Johnny.
Thank you. I can't find the quote, but he says something about how when we trust someone and we find out that they were untrustworthy, it hurts.
Yes. Yeah.
If we don't trust someone and we find out that they were trustworthy,
it hurts.
Hurts. Yeah.
Yeah. And who is that? Is that Bateson?
Yeah, it was in. I can't find the exact quote, but I think it's the nature of our minds to register to those effects of our trust and our distrust.
And it's interesting. It hurts either way. It can hurt either way.
Yes.
So I loved your descriptions of your responses to Doug's statements.
Dilemma. What a wonderful dilemma that is, Doug.
It's such a sensitive way of looking at things, and I can see how you're using these clean language ideas, which I'm maybe slightly more comfortable with than I used to be, and applying them in this way. Anyway, I need to think about that more. I did want to come back to a couple of things. So I just want to say, I didn't want to move on quickly from that, because I think this is really important to acknowledge and recognize these issues, because when we're talking about overlapping fields as individuals and attending to the field, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you, Geoffrey.
I did want to come back just really quickly to this all men are responsible thing, because although I understand the sensitivity and the questions that you have, Michael, about it, I do tend to think that oppression of women and oppression of gay are not the same level oppressions, because in some sense the oppression of women prefigures the oppression of gay. The patriarchy, which the oppression of women sits in that patriarchal organization of society, also leads partly to the oppression of gay. And so they're linked together. And you can't say, just because you can't say all heterosexuals are responsible for gay, then you can't turn around and say, well, all men aren't responsible for the thing. And it's an argument. It's more that there's a set of attitudes and practices that we call the patriarchy, and all men benefit and contribute to those practices. And so when we say all men are responsible, we're saying something much more nuanced, and we're using a language shorthand when we say doesn't mean all men are responsible individuals for all of those acts. Well, but it does mean that all men take part and benefit to some extent. I think it's a more nuanced argument, but you can't just throw the argument out because the all men is responsible.
Let me, going off of what you're saying, and it makes sense. But patriarchy as a system affected all human beings. It down the road, and yes, some were privileges and stuff. But I'm coming from a place that that's not acknowledged. Oppression of any kind affects the human body. Okay, and I know that men have been played a part. I understand that argument, but I am not going to accept that argument that you're not going to let me express that I've been affected and oppressed by that same system of patriarchy in my own way.
Yeah, but you have to be careful, because the way you phrase it can come across as very defensive and very...
It is defensive. I'll accept it's defensive.
And acknowledging one's own oppression is one thing, but it doesn't mean to say one's denying the other, and one has to be careful of it. So it's just let's be a little bit careful about the way we use language in this area.
I would, but Geoffrey, I'm being pushing back, but I agree. I don't disagree with you. But what about the language that they're using? I'm representative of a 65-year-old white dude, and I get so much shit for being in this stereotype. I'm sick and tired of it.
Right. I hear you, Michael, and I hear you, Geoffrey, and I'm going to quote Margaret Mead, who said 60 years ago, there's no such thing as a patriarchal society or a matriarchal society. She believes that you can't have one without the other. And there's no society that's only been one or the other. And there have been many women who give away their power to men, and they watch their boys persecuted and do nothing to stop it. And to me, I think that's child abuse. Now, am I going to tell this to my mother? Well, I actually have told this to my mother. I stopped my father as soon as I could from hitting you. You never stopped him from hitting me. And you know what my mother said to me? This is the threshold. And I popped, and I never went back. He did an egregious, violent act towards her. He actually caught her dress on fire. This was in a car. He threw his lit cigar at her. It went into her lap and started a fire. He stopped the car, got out, and abandoned us. The big truck came along, blew a big gust of wind. She was on flames. I put out the fire, and I told my brother to get in the car to drive us to where we needed to go. And I said, you got to leave this man. I was an adult at this point. I said, you know, someday he's going to hit you and you're not going to get off the floor. And she said to me, don't you love your father? And I said, I'm never, ever coming home again. I've had it with you people. I'm finished. Now, I'm just saying my obsession, perhaps, with double messages comes from that original family mind. And I've managed to stay away for, I think I didn't see my family for 25 years. And I went back for a weekend. You know, and some people, family for them is just cozy and warm and snug as a bug in a rug, you know, but that was not the kind of childhood that I had. And I don't think I'm actually that rare. I think actually a lot of people had very violent childhoods. Some people do find ways of picking up the pieces from those kind of fragmented zones. And I'm looking at that wonderful message in that Erin Manning's book on Making the Cut. She talks about this wonderful ritual. And I spoke about this at the cafe the other day. There's something the depressed person says, spirits, leave me alone to complete the business of my life and know that I will never forget you. I think that's such beautiful, beautiful. It's such a beautiful message and a beautiful meta message to anyone who's ever been depressed. That there is a way out of it. And you do need, though, sometimes a community of people who are going to, you know, beat the drum and create the chants and dig a ditch and bury you in it and pull you out of it and cut the ram's throat and have blood pouring all over you. And then you can, that kind of drama is necessary so that you can cross that threshold together with your community. And I mourn, and I think Erin Manning brings this forward too, the fact that we don't live in a culture that supports that kind of collective responsibility for another person's wound or hurt or psychic damage. And I think we're all up against it because, you know, some of the wounds are pretty deep and haven't healed. And I think there's, I don't think going into a dingy little conference room and talking about your problems all day is going to have a huge effect. And I think this is something that Erin Manning was pointing out in contrasting and comparing these different ways of working with trauma and how different cultures have come up with rituals and relationships and intentions in unique and novel ways. So I think we should learn from all of these traditions. So thank you very much.
So it's I'll let you speak, I'll let you go in a moment, Michael. So it's the end of the 2-hour slot, and I do like to finish the Bateson within that.
I think this is very Batesonian, by the way.
Yeah, I do too. But
this
I was
is what Bateson was talking about.
Could we continue the discussion next week? Because the topic is pathologies of epistemology, and it seems to me that this is a pathology of epistemology that we're talking about.
That's right.
So,
I'll take that.
I was going to suggest, Michael, that you take it on
Yeah.
as your presentation, and then we can come back to this whole issue in that context, because I think it's a very good one.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Do we all? It's just two more. We have one after the next one.
I think there's three more.
Two more readings and then a
and then a recap. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to get a context,
Yeah.
and I know we're going to end. So, Geoffrey, real quick, the only thing I want to say, and I know you probably are. Our fields are intermeshing and intertangled. It's not. I agree with you. The notion is to be sensitive. I guess and John did a good job. I'm just trying to learn how to honor my own sensitivity in the midst of somebody else's sensitivity.
Or insensitivity.
And that's a good point. Part of it gets entangled with insensitive, and maybe on my part as much as how I was trying to respond to what I coming from the other person, that entanglement, that ambiguity. Overall, I feel I handled it well. I hope I get animated, but some people interpret that as I'm angry. No, I'm just animated.
Could you remind me of the context? What was this
This was actually 4 people after finishing a meditation group going to a Thai restaurant and discussing.
I was about to say you should discuss it over lunch, but that's what you did. So,
but it ended. I mean, it had tension in it, and it ended civilly. I just want to say that there was a civility that ended it, but it had the tension in it.
But we all have these discussions.
Yeah.
The one I had on the weekend was very close to this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I got rudely tapped over the hands for things that I said and did, where to some extent it was exactly the kind of sensitivity that you're talking about. And you mea culpa on my side, but it wasn't all on my side, the problem. So. And the other side of the problem didn't get fully addressed. So, so I'm looking for ways to make sure that it does get addressed at a later time, right? So
because it's this notion of speaking truth in the presence of, especially in your case, egregious, and Nora's case, these fascist elements. How do we speak up to them? We had somebody Nora referred to, like the previous of on the train, and the Muslim woman, and how she working with that.
And most of this is invisible. This work is invisible work, and it's also anticipation work. We're anticipating the future, and we're working now to provide conditions that are livable for a future. So I think we have to take some responsibility for how indeterminate all of this is.
Right.
And ambiguous, but ambiguity can be beautiful, and we can exit a pathological system.
Yes.
You don't have to sit there and make it work. You can say bye-bye.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are getting ready to do that with the system that we're in now.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna have fun this week working with the next reading. Thank you, Geoffrey. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's perfect timing in a way. Thank you.
So you good, Doug? Did you have any final words that you want?
No, I didn't. I do not. Good session. Thanks for bearing with me as I tried.
Thanks to everyone. I
Thank
always
you all.
I always feel that we're moving forward collectively in our understanding of the Bateson every time.
I do too.
I agree.
I do too.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Never.